Hello, everyone. So, this will be the Longlegs lecture. So, to introduce Longlegs, it was released last summer in July of 2024, and it was directed by Osgood Perkins, who is the son of none other than Anthony Perkins, who played Norman Bates in the 1960 horror classic Psycho. So, Longlegs is a horror movie, obviously, and it's also a serial killer movie. And that makes sense for the director, whose father played a famous character who was a serial killer. But it is also steeped in the tradition of a lot of devil-based horror movies that came out in the 60s and early 70s. Like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and The Omen. And I think that'll make sense as to why it made that choice of being not just a serial killer movie, but a satanic serial killer movie when we consider its setting of the 1990s and the attitude towards Satanism that was prevalent back then and in many ways continues today. So the movie was well received, and I think I would agree with critics who thought it was good, because I think there's a lot going on under the surface and it still manages to be entertaining while also being quite complex in what it's trying to say. So let's explore what it's trying to say. And in order to understand its message, or arrive at its message, we of course need some context. So I provided some context for us that I thought were significant. First, we'll do some citational context, comparing it to other horror movies. So it is very much inspired by The Silence of the Lambs, which came out in 1991. And The Silence of the Lambs, in case you don't know, is about an FBI agent or trainee who interviews a captured serial killer, Hannibal Lecter, in order to get clues to capture Buffalo Bill, another serial killer. So, yeah, we can see the parallels of, we have an FBI agent as our protagonist in this movie in the form of Lee Harker, and she has a relationship of sorts, or a history, I should say, with Longlegs, in somewhat the same way that Clarice Starling has a strange sort of friendly relationship in a way with Hannibal Lecter. But of course, Longlegs isn't friendly to Lee at all. He only pretended to be when he came to visit her on that terrifying, snowy morning. So yeah, very much influenced by Silence of the Lambs, but quite different from it. And also a big influence on it. Well, perhaps not influence. I don't think the director ever said he was directly inspired by this, but Hereditary is another movie, a recent one from 2018, that is also about occult things, in this case, witches. And it's about, if you don't know, this family, and the daughter is killed in a horrible accident, and it was all set up by this coven of witches, and it turns out that the mom's mother was a witch and she never knew about it. And they basically, the witches, manipulate their lives unseen. And that sort of goes along with what we see in Longlegs, where try as the characters might, they cannot avoid their fate. They don't have any control over their destinies, which, because of occult influences and powers, which we also see in Hereditary. And that leads me to historical and sociocultural context. So it was released in 2024, and I think I can safely say we're experiencing a lot of social change here in 2024, even more so than the 2010s, especially in terms of certain forms of expression becoming less taboo. And in our case, for Longlegs, I would say Satanism is not nearly as violently opposed as it was in the past, question mark. At least not to the degree that it was in the 80s and 90s, around the time the movie is set. And in 2023, during Christmas, the Satanic Temple sort of tested their First Amendment rights by putting up this altar in the Iowa Capitol. Probably in, protest of Christian symbols and monuments being put in government spaces. And it really sparked, a controversy. I think someone even went out of their way to tear this down. So yeah, we are definitely facing a lot of social change and cultural change right now. And I think the movie Longlegs is telling us, that can be scary, but in the end, it's pretty much inevitable that change will happen in our society. So let's continue to explore that. Alright, I already sort of hit upon this, but Longlegs is, of course, a horror movie that is its genre, and I don't know if you noticed, but it really seems like Perkins put every horror movie trope he could think of and put it in a blender, because we have a serial killer like Norman Bates and countless other killers in movies. We have demonic possession in the form of the dolls influencing the fathers to kill their families. Speaking of dolls, we have a creepy doll, like Annabelle here. We have the dolls that are Longlegs murder weapons. So yeah, it definitely is leaning into all of the most familiar horror tropes you can imagine. And at first glance, it would seem to be, oh, this is just an unoriginal derivative horror movie that throws everything at the wall. But really, I think it does that on purpose. It is intentionally fantastic and bizarre because it's trying to say that real life is not as real life with societal change, etc., is not as scary as what we see in the movie, because the movie is really over the top. It's an exaggerated version of reality. It portrays Satan worship in a way that doesn't really happen in real life. So, we'll come back to that, but I did want to mention symbols in the movie. We have the dolls, which are probably the biggest symbol, and I think they really do represent control, obviously, because they cause the fathers to become possessed. In Lee's case, the doll suppresses her memories of Longlegs, so she can't capture him, although she ends up doing so anyway. So good for her. She defied the doll's influence. Yay Lee, woo! And that leads me to the crucifixes, which are sort of, I would say the dolls are meant to be parodies of the crucifixes, because a crucifix at the end of the day is, a figure like a doll. And I think in using dolls, there could be something of Longlegs trying to mock Christianity and God by making satanic dolls that sort of are the opposite of a crucifix. And the fact that they find a doll of Carrie Ann camera under the crucifix in the barn really really supports that. And then we have, speaking of cameras, we have the Polaroid camera. So the camera, Carrie Ann camera, and then an actual camera. What I'm getting at is the camera is what reveals Longlegs. When Lee takes a picture of him when she's little, and then when she goes through her stuff at her mother's house, she finds the Polaroid picture of Longlegs, which triggers her memory. So that is what gives her the necessary information, the clue to find Longlegs, in the same way that Carrie Ann camera led her to the dolls. So yeah, it also reawakens her memory of Longlegs, which the dolls had tried to suppress. So the camera, I think, uh, represents breaking away from an attempt at outside forces to control you, right? And vampires, stay with me. Vampires don't have reflections and don't appear in photographs as a result, right? And I just mentioned that because Harker, that sort of reminds me of the protagonist of Dracula, Jonathan Harker, and that is Lee's last name. Almost as if Longlegs is a sort of vampire figure. Alright, but we'll move on from the Polaroid camera. The presidential portraits, if you notice in the movie, we see Bill Clinton in Carter's office, and we also see Richard Nixon in the camera household. So why is that? Well, for one thing, it establishes the two timelines, right? Of the 70s and the 90s, when the film's main action takes place. The 70s was when Lee was young, and Carrie Ann also, she was a kid in the 70s. Richard Nixon, of course, a conservative Republican politician, president, and he's in the camera home as a picture with a crucifix again in frame when we see him above the entrance to the living room. So the cameras were a very, I guess you could say, traditional, religious family. They're farmers, but in a rural area. But even that doesn't save them, which is really disturbing and frightening. It says that no one is safe, in other words. And there's also, with Bill Clinton, I am not sure what he means exactly. Other than he might represent changing attitudes, because the 90s, they seem really conservative now, here in the 2020s. But back then, they were less straight-laced than the 70s were, to say the least. So I think he might just represent social change. And I mean, of course, he also has his Nixon had a lot of scandals, but his were political, whereas here we have, a sex scandal. So, yeah, we see how Clinton reflects, changing attitudes in society, and more, I suppose you could say, sexual freedom or what have you. or a sexual looseness at least, and he could represent the rise of moral looseness in general, which might allow satanic forces to creep in. And looking at Nixon with Watergate, etc., perhaps moral looseness had been emerging for longer than we realized. So that's what I would make of the presidential portraits. And along those lines, you know, we could believe that, you know, under Nixon, with our religious values strong, etc., during his administration in the era of the 70s, we should be safe in theory, correct? Well, you know, no one ever really is safe, you know. Longlegs started his murders in the 70s, obviously, and he got Carrie Ann, or almost did at least, killed her family, even though she came from a religious background. And that just goes to show that we really don't have control over our destinies. Control over one's destiny is an illusion, Longlegs says. And that makes sense when you think about it, because Ruth, Lee's mother, tries to control Longlegs by saying, "I'll help you if you spare my daughter," but of course she ends up giving him more power than ever by delivering those dolls to those families, right? And Longlegs threatens to kill Lee's mother, or at least says that Lee's mother will die if she exposes him. So Lee tries to prevent that, but she is the one who ends up killing her mother, because she has to when her mother tries to kill Ruby. And that just goes to show that you can try to prevent a negative outcome, but in the end, it's still going to happen. We see that stated by Ruth herself. She initially tells Lee over the phone that our prayers can protect us from the devil, but then she says, you know what, they don't, and she's very bitter because of what Longlegs has trapped her in, it seems like. And the prayers really couldn't stop Longlegs, or the devil, who he works for. The man downstairs, as he calls him. Lee also has this ability to see things before they happen, kind of, because, you know, she knows where the house a suspect is hiding in, but she could see that, but she wasn't able to see her partner getting shot at the beginning. So even though she has all this intuition and intelligence and figures out basically Longlegs' modus operandi, she can't control him in the end, because she's only half psychic, as Carter puts it. Something else, I have this picture up here of the beast coming out of the sea, which is referenced in the movie. It's the book of Revelation, and of course that is the apocalypse. That book tells of the biblical apocalypse, what we think of as the second coming, the end of the world, what have you. And that can't be stopped. I mean, no matter if you're a believer, the world is going to end in some way, be it in the way Revelation describes, be it in some other way. The end of the world, the apocalypse, is coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And Ruth does say she will continue delivering the dolls until she sees that beast rise up out of the sea, until the end of the world, in other words. So yeah, that all goes to show that we really have no control over our destiny. But perhaps we can prevent some tragedy on the way, as the apocalypse draws near, which is an idea we'll come to later. I wanted to note satanic panic as a theme in this movie, which I think just makes sense considering it's set in the 1990s, sort of at the height of satanic panic. And satanic panic, if you don't know, was a wave of moral panic that originated in the US in the 1980s. It came out of the United States specifically, and then sort of spread to other parts of the world. And many people did believe that there were satanic killers on the prowl, and that children, a lot of the time, they believed were being killed in satanic occult rituals. They thought media was infused with satanic influence. Probably the most famous example is Dungeons and Dragons, which some parents thought was the devil. But yeah, in hindsight, it was a lot of paranoia, it seems like. I don't have the numbers on how many satanic killings actually happened, if any, but nothing like what happens in Longlegs, of course, ever happened. There were no dolls that influenced fathers to murder their families or anything of that nature. And Longlegs himself seems, I don't want to say funny, but he is, well, maybe he is kind of funny. He's weird, right? He's very weird. And he seems sort of like a parody of a satanic serial killer someone might be afraid of during satanic panic. He's really ridiculous. And his murder plans with the dolls is just so over the top. And it seems like that is meant to satirize satanic panic. The film might be saying you would be crazy to take the idea of satanic serial killers seriously, because they're just pretend, the film would seem to say. They are not something you would encounter in real life, at least not on a usual basis. And something else is to really underscore that. They make Longlegs look like exactly what a parent in satanic panic times would be afraid of. Someone who openly mocks Christianity or tries to subvert it. Notice that he wears all white. He has pale makeup. It looks like a bucket of white paint was dumped on him, honestly. And that just goes to show that he's trying to come off as pure. White usually represents purity, but of course he's evil. He's the exact opposite. He even talks about how Lee's house was so white, whiter than even the camera's farmhouse, and that seeing the white house, he knew that his work was immaculate, and of course it's the opposite. And he has Ruth, dressing as a nun, pretending to be from the church. The movie also looks like it takes place at Christmas, and I think there's a Christmas tree in one of the victims' houses, and it's like Longlegs is ushering the birth of Satan instead of the birth of Christ. Especially when we go back and look at that crucifix in the barn. Remember baby Jesus surrounded by hay in his manger. It's sort of like Longlegs is making fun of that by having the crucifix there in the barn. So, yeah. This all, I think, is in service of satirizing satanic panic. He flips good things on their head by, mocking Christianity by saying, I'm immaculate, and of course he isn't. And all of that he's, exactly what people who were afraid of satanic killers think a satanic killer would be. And that would be people like this. So, yeah, and this is actually quite recent, this picture. Um, there is a controversy in this country currently if people have a right to worship the devil. In the movie, they actually say Longlegs worships the devil, that's for sure. But in the United States of America, he's allowed to do that. But should he be allowed to do that? The film doesn't altogether say either way, at least not explicitly. But I would say, in satirizing satanic panic, the film seems to implicitly be saying, yes, you do have a right to worship Satan, but people who are afraid of Satan worshippers should chill out, because what we present in the movie, the director seems to say, is not what real life is. Real life Satanists, I don't know if y'all know, but they don't actually worship Satan literally. They just use him as a symbol for what they consider liberation. So real life Satanists probably aren't going around doing things like Longlegs is. They're not trying to openly mock or damage or subvert Christianity. They're not going around killing children through magical means, etc. So what is the message? I think we pretty much just said it. It's shedding a light on how ludicrous satanic panic was, and it also, I would argue, is saying overall that we shouldn't fear social change in the United States. We should adapt. Sure, we can't change the course of things, how things are going, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're doomed. Because in the end, we do have some hope. Because even though Lee runs out of ammo, because of course she does, to shoot the doll, she and Ruby still leave. They get out in the end. They can't defy their fates, but they can, live another day. So the film seems to be saying all this social change that's happening, don't be afraid of it. It probably doesn't mean you're doomed. Alright, so final thoughts. I thought this movie was very complex. I had somewhat of a challenge of pinning down what I thought it was ultimately saying, but when I saw that quote about he's allowed to worship the devil in the United States, that's when it all sort of clicked for me. But there are other aspects of this film you might explore. It has some things about gender that we didn't really touch upon, like, Lee being a female FBI agent and Ruby asking if that's scary, and Lee saying it is, and Longlegs himself is sort of androgynous looking, seems to be, looks like a man, also sort of looks like a woman, and actually people did point that out and sort of complain about it, like, what are you saying, people who are non-binary or transgender or what have you, are they supposed to be scary and evil and satanic? So that's something else to consider. But yeah, there's issues of gender in there you might explore, and there's a lot in here you might explore. And I invite you to do so in addition to using this video as a starting point. But yeah, Longlegs, it would seem to be just, a bunch of horror tropes thrown into a blender, unoriginal or what have you, but I don't think that's the case. I think it is very much aware of what it's doing by using those horror tropes, and I think it's a complex film with a lot to say, and it's relevant to our time. So that's what I gotta say on Longlegs. Hopefully that helps get the juices flowing for the paper if you choose to write on this. Thank you guys. I'll see y'all next time.